while he's approaching the stand, I'd like to, for the record, make a correction. Mr. Clark does not have a PhD, so it was erroneous for me to refer to him as Dr. Clark in my offer of witness. We neglected to proofread that document, which is a cardinal sin for somebody trained as a newspaper reporter. So with that correction, I'll offer Brian Clark's witness.
Thank you for the clarification. But turn your microphone on. There you go. Make yourself comfortable. Make sure you're speaking into the microphone no matter where you're turning. Go ahead and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to provide is true and accurate?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Isenhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Clark, are you the Ryan Clark whose testimony I solicited and filed on September 11th? Yes. If I were to ask you the same questions today, would your answers be the same? Yes. Do you have any corrections or additions to that testimony? No, I do not. Would now be the appropriate time to offer his testimony and exhibits?
Are you making that motion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I believe there are three. One is his CV, and a couple others are PowerPoint presentations he has made on this subject.
Okay, thank you. Do we have an objection?
Your Honor, the counties have some concerns about how late this testimony was filed, and it seems to be of the kind of gravity that would demand that parties have a chance to find other experts to inform our questioning of this witness and maybe find rebuttal testimony. This was filed on September 11th, and we don't claim that it's not relevant, but struggling a little bit with the time we've had to prepare for this witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, did you have a comment, or are you lining up first?
Okay. Lining up first.
We got you. Are there any other objections before the board makes a decision?
Your Honor, I'm at least partially going to join and partially going to resist Mr. Whipple's objection. We do have concerns about the timeliness, and it obviously was well after the deadline, including the deadline for witnesses and exhibits. I want to reserve that because there are other examples of brand new persons being brought in, brand new parties being brought in, that I'm going to want to reserve for later. On this one, I think that if the board lets it in, that is not cause to allow any sort of additional rebuttal. There normally wouldn't be a rebuttal round to this testimony anyway. We're now 8 days past and providing 8 days of opportunity for preparation of cross, which certainly we've done things quicker in this case, but we do have concerns about the timeliness of the filing, and that will be a theme that will recur here in the coming weeks. So.
Would you like me to make an observation, Mr. Chair?
Not yet, but in a moment you'll have a chance. Mr. Whippel, did you have a response or clarification?
One clarification, Your Honor. Not exactly asking for more rounds of rebuttal, but I would say the counties would very much have preferred this testimony to come in much earlier, so that it could have been more fully developed as part of the record, both the direct testimony and the exhibits. So I'm not trying to drag out the proceedings, but this seems to be important testimony.
Thank you. Representative, did you have...
I acknowledge the lack of timeliness on this and would have not objected had the board decided not to allow me to offer the witness. I would just note that in response to previous testimony, 2 of the 3 board members asked specifically about the potential for carbon sequestration in Iowa. Therefore, I thought it important to make this testimony available.
Thank you. Let's give us just a minute here. Sorry for the pause. Appreciate that. After much deliberation, the board will be admitting the evidence and testimony of the witness from Representative Isenhart. However, at this point, we also want to remind the parties yet again that our rules and our procedures have been in the administrative code. They have been in our orders for months. Attorneys and parties continue to file late and file improperly. We have rules and we have procedures for a reason. And it is very frustrating to try to put on a timely and orderly hearing when so many parties refuse to follow these rules. So this evidence appears to be relevant. As such, we will admit it and put the parties on notice yet again that we encourage you to review the rules and previous orders and act accordingly. Representative Isenhart?
Thank you. Points taken. I make Mr. Clark available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, you're first.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, the substance of your testimony is that your agency, the Geological Survey, is, I'm not sure if exploring is the right word in this context, but considering the idea that maybe there is a site in Iowa where the carbon dioxide from the ethanol plants could be sequestered. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think I would suggest maybe using the word we believe that it can happen. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that we are actively researching it. But yes, it is our belief that the potential is there.
Okay. I guess you anticipated my next question. How much do you know, and what is the state of your belief, so to speak, that there could be a sequestration site in Iowa?
It's a tough one to answer, but I'll try. It comes down to, the state of our understanding of the deep subsurface geology of Iowa is more limited than some states. Part of that is because we don't have a history of petroleum production or other extractive industries that would require, more investigation of the deep subsurface. So, based on the limited information that we do have of the rocks that would be considered targets, the evidence from those samples looks like there could be some places in Iowa where we could do this.
And do you have any sense of whether that would be sufficient space, underground space, to store the amount of carbon dioxide that the Summit and the other pipeline companies, for that matter, are considering?
The evidence we have does suggest that there would be enough storage space, yes.
On into the future?
Yes.
I think your testimony indicated that aside from the Geologic Survey, there were other studies that have been or are being conducted on sequestration in Iowa. What are those studies and what have they shown so far?
I had made that comment in my written testimony because I'm aware of some private companies that have asked the Iowa Geological Survey for certain information. Some of those companies have actually just said outright that we are looking at the potential to sequester in Iowa, and that's as far as it's gotten. That's all that I know.
Are you at liberty to tell us what those companies are?
I'd rather not.
level of interest, or how serious have these inquiries been by these other companies?
I'm not sure how to gauge the seriousness. Sorry.
Well, let me rephrase the question.
Thank you.
Have these companies expressed definite interest in doing that, or is it just kind of, well, maybe we'd like to do it, we don't know? Sort of, where does it fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, the contact that I've had, typically, I've had more contact with, I guess I would say, consultants, so other geoscientists.
Mm-hmm.
It has ranged from, hey, I've got a client that's kind of interested, what do you know? And I'll send them the report that we've got and show them where some of our database links are and things like that. And then it's ranged from that level of interest to, we've signed we've been contracted by a company within the state of Iowa to look at, the feasibility of carbon sequestration in Iowa.
Okay. Have any ethanol plants talked with the Geological Survey about sequestering in Iowa rather than piping the carbon dioxide to some other state?
Yes, they have.
So that seems to be a feasible option for ethanol plants, do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Have you talked with Summit Agricultural Group about carbon sequestration in Iowa?
Yeah, that was included in my testimony, my written testimony.
Can you tell us more about those discussions, when they were, what resulted from those discussions?
In my written testimony, I think I gave the date of our first contact. Bear with me just a second, please. It would have been July 9th of 2020 was the first time I was reached by phone from somebody with Summit Agricultural Group. And they had requested a virtual meeting, which we held the next day on July 10th. And that was myself and my supervisor, Keith Schilling. And we gave them, it was just one person actually. It was a Zoom meeting, so we gave a PowerPoint presentation very similar to the one that was submitted as, I don't know which exhibit number it was, but same information that we've got here.
Is that the same PowerPoint that was submitted or shown to the Iowa House Environmental Protection Committee last spring?
This is very similar, yes.
So when you talked to Summit Ag Group, who was it you talked to specifically?
His name was John Probst.
Okay. And it was Summit Agricultural Group and not Summit Carbon Solutions, correct?
Correct.
So was there any follow-up to that or any further interest?
Yes, there were some follow-up questions that I answered via email. I think we may have spoken on the phone also a few more times.
Has there been any follow-up more recently with Summit, either Summit Ag or Summit Carbon Solutions?
Not recently, no.
If your agency were given enough funding, which is always questionable, to do an investigation of carbon sequestration in Iowa, what would be involved and how long would that take?
Of course, that depends on how much funding we're talking about, but let's go with an ideal scenario. To characterize, let's say, one site that would say the size of a typical ethanol plant, we would start there and say this is our spot where we want to focus our activities. I would say it would take, as quickly as 2 years, maybe 2 to 4 years, I would safely say, to get to the point where we can identify absolutely, yes, we can store at this location or we cannot. So yeah, I would say 2 to 4 years. And, funding wise, that would probably range. I've given estimates in the past. There's some that are part of the exhibit, so I wish I could nail it down to exactly that, but could be on the order of $3 to $5 million, maybe certainly up from there, depending on what you do.
Okay. And that would need to come from the legislature? The funding?
Are you asking me that's where I want it to come from?
Well, would it come from the legislature?
It could.
Okay. What other source might there be?
The federal government has grants out there that are available for this type of research. Obviously, if an ethanol company wanted to go on their own and hire us, we could go that route. There's a number of different routes.
Okay. Finally, on page 10, line 13 of your testimony, I wasn't quite clear what you were saying there. If we can get that up.
That's a question.
Oh, the question mentions 13 sites. How does the 13 sites fit into what we've just been talking about as far as exploration for a sequestration site?
These questions were provided to me by Representative Isenhart. As to where he came up with the question, I couldn't speak to that.
That's what I should have asked him.
I suppose so.
All right. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. I had Mr. Whippel next, and I apologize if I missed Mr. Jorde, so.
I'll go. Mr. Clark, let's go back to, you described a meeting with Summit, and it was one person?
Yes.
Mr. Probst. Do you recall Mr. Probst identifying his position in the company?
I don't recall off the top of my head, no.
I may not get the title right, but I believe there was testimony in this proceeding that he was a chief financial officer. I guess my question is, did you have a clear understanding that you weren't speaking to a scientist or an engineer?
Yes, I knew that.
Okay. And so you've provided this information now to the legislature, right?
Correct.
And to other companies, right? You won't identify which, but to other companies.
Yes.
And the answer has been the same every time from you. Is that right? That is possible.
Correct.
Do you have a sense of the capacity of Iowa for this storage? Is there a limit on capacity here?
I mean, the numbers that we have is, again, based on very limited data and some very, wide-ranging assumptions. So the end values that we can come up with are so wide-ranging, but they're non-zero.
I guess I'd like to zero it. Well, I guess I'd like to get to a little bit more than non-zero. The Summit's proposing to capture carbon from more than 30 ethanol plants. Is there capacity in Iowa for that much carbon?
An average Iowa ethanol plant emits how many metric tons of CO2 per year? Do you want to say 300,000, 400,000?
I'm interested in what you told Summit.
Yeah.
I guess
I could.
Did you tell them there was capacity for the scope of their project? Did they identify the scope of their project? First of all, I should ask.
I said that there's All right, so let's look at whatever exhibit is the PowerPoint presentation. Maybe it's best to go this route. Where did I put that? So the total that I'd come up with, and this is just me trying to cobble things together, I believe was, at the time that I made this presentation, about 12.8 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And that's from all Iowa ethanol, or that was with the figure that we had produced about 4.5 billion gallons of ethanol per year. So round that up to 13 million metric tons per year. Do I think that we could store that in Iowa? Based on what I know right now, I think it's possible.
So I guess what I'm really driving at here is Summit's petition and evidence submitted in this docket identifies North Dakota as the only feasible site and states that there's not geologic feasibility in Iowa. And obviously your testimony directly contradicts that. So I guess I'd like you to explain how you account for that based on your conversations with them and the opinions you've now provided to many about the feasibility of this. How do you account for the difference?
I really have no idea how Summit came to that conclusion, so I can't speak to that. But I can just point to the evidence that we have, which is very well summarized in our Technical Information Series number 58, that I believe was part of the, I can't remember if that's been submitted as an exhibit or not.
If it's not a geologic reason, would it be possible for it to be a business reason or a financial reason?
That's beyond my area of expertise.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Jorde?
Thank you. Picking up on that question that Mr. Taylor asked to be displayed up there, the question was if Summit Carbon Solutions were interested in characterizing 13 sites for its contracted carbon dioxide emitters, the cost could be $52 million or possibly more, correct? And you said correct. Now, are you proposing that there would be individual storage location per site, or is there likely a location in Iowa generally that could capture all 13, or what's the breakdown?
So based on my experience in working with the Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative, which is a regional consortium of 22, I think, states, 21 or 22 states, where we, the point of the MRCI is to accelerate CCUS throughout our region, and that has to do with both compiling all the research, the data that we've got across the states that's available, and partnering with that consortium and attending meetings, and then also talking to other state surveys like in Kansas and Illinois and some of these places that have already had active carbon sequestration. I've come up with a fairly firm understanding that there's two ways that we could do this. There's the real large-scale commercial hub, which is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit in the CCS industry. The idea of gathering as much CO2 as you can and from a geographic region and finding a hub nearby that you can then store it all in. I don't see that as necessarily the only way that this should be approached. I feel like you could do smaller, more distributed carbon sequestration where perhaps there is just a single ethanol plant that is able to store its own emissions, and that's it. 400, 500,000, tons a year. So anywhere from there to the large scale, 10 million metric tons per year, I think. I think at least in terms of the state of Iowa, all those options should be investigated.
Okay, so based on the geological information you have, the best information, you believe there's likely localized solutions as well as potentially formation in Iowa appropriate to handle more of a large-scale sequestration project.
Yes.
And is there a particular county or counties that you believe geologically would best be suited to handle larger volumes from multiple sources?
Again, without knowing for sure that we can do this in any one particular or multiple formations, I just don't know. I know where the formations are that I think are the highest potential.
Yes.
I have to use my words here. Essentially, there's a feature called the Mid-Continent Rift System, and it occupies an area it comes into the state from the southwest sort of corner, and then it runs up through and exits Iowa through the north central part. This geologic feature continues up into Minnesota underneath Lake Superior, and down around into Michigan. So it's a very large feature. It underlies at least 30-35% of the state of Iowa. And we know it's there. We don't know in detail what its carbon sequestration potential is right now. But based on the information we do have, it's something that I think is worth looking at. And because it's so vast, it's really hard for me to pinpoint which area is going to be the best potential.
In southwestern Iowa, where you say this formation enters the state, are you aware if there's any significant oil or gas production activities going on in that region also?
There are no petroleum activities in Iowa, as far as I know.
Okay. So do you understand that where Summit's proposing to sequester in North Dakota is some approximately 40 miles from large production of natural gas and crude oil?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Board questions? Okay.
Just a couple quick questions. So are you aware of the work that the National Energy Technology Laboratory does in this arena?
I'm somewhat familiar, yes.
Would that be a facility you would use to do the testing of the samples, the core samples?
In my experience in preparing a proposal to do this type of research using Department of Energy funding, it seems to be customary or certainly beneficial to partner with a national lab. NETL is the only national lab that is actually operated by the Department of Energy, so they end up on a lot of these. Actually, I take that back. I don't think NETL can be a part of a DOE grant. So let's just assume that I'm not sure how that affiliation is. But yes, NETL does do a lot of testing related to carbon sequestration. But it kind of depends. I mean, if I'm looking at basaltic mineralization, then there's another national lab, I believe it's called Northwest National Labs, that has been doing quite a bit of research in basaltic mineralization. So that might be a better lab to partner with, so it kind of depends.
So, from your professional standpoint, what is it that we need to have in Iowa, and how does the process work? In just kind of layman's terms, what do we need to have, and then how is it sequestered? How is it kept there?
So just to clarify, you're asking what properties of the formations are needed to, okay. So it boils down to porosity and permeability in most cases. So think of a sponge. You know, some rocks actually behave like sponges. And a sponge can absorb water because it has open pore spaces within it that the water can sit in, and you can wring the sponge out because those pore spaces are connected. And so how a fluid can move from one pore space to another is its permeability. the higher your porosity, the higher your permeability, the more fluid that rock can hold. So that's one thing that you need to look for are formations that have high porosity, high permeability. In the case of carbon sequestration, typically the CO2 is captured as a gas and then it's dehydrated and compressed into what's called a supercritical fluid. This fluid needs to be under a certain amount of pressure, and that relates to injecting at least 2,700 feet underground to maintain it as a liquid so that it doesn't depressurize and turn back into a gas phase and therefore potentially leak. So keeping the depth in mind and porosity permeability, those are kind of your constraints. To go a step further, when you're talking about rock formations that are porous and permeable, those tend to be aquifers. They hold groundwater. One of the requirements for evaluating if a rock formation can be utilized for carbon sequestration is whether the groundwater that's within that aquifer could ever be used for drinking. So is it potable water or not? The EPA has set a limit of 10,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. And that's a standard water quality parameter that essentially refers to the salinity, how many different minerals are dissolved in that water. 10,000 parts per million and higher, that's water that nobody would ever want to drink. So you have to, once you find a formation that's deep enough, porous and permeable enough, then it also cannot have water that's considered potable. So you have to look for those factors. And then the sidebar that I touched on earlier is there's a slightly different formation that you can look at, which are igneous rocks. They're not, they're rocks that were magma. May have been erupted at the land surface, which would be known as basalt. Turns out a lot of research has been going into what happens when you inject supercritical CO2 into basalt formations. When that happens, studies have shown that the supercritical CO2 actually converts to the mineral calcite or anchorite or some type of mineral. And those minerals have been proven to be very stable in the rock formation. So this idea of basaltic mineralization is picking up some attention and some speed. It turns out that the Mid-Continent Rift system that I talked about earlier has a very large portion of it is occupied with basalts.
So in reading through your testimony, one of the things that stuck out with me is just the cost. The cost per bore. Why? I mean, if you can explain that a little bit, why it's so expensive.
Sure. Drilling to assess whether you can do sequestration requires, again, a tremendous depth. Drilling 2,700 feet deep, even for a water well, is a pretty big undertaking and fairly expensive. But this isn't just to make a hole in the ground. This is, we have to retrieve samples, solid cylindrical core samples of different rock formations so that we can subject them to laboratory testing. So, you know, that adds a lot of cost to it when you're drilling 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet down and you're trying to retrieve solid cylinders of core that can be tens of feet long. Takes a specialized drill rig, different capabilities, things like that. So that's a pretty big expense. And then what's folded into those costs is usually the downhole analyses that are done. So instruments can be lowered down the hole once it's been drilled, and these instruments can collect a myriad of data that's very useful, such as the porosity and permeability. It can identify different changes in lithologies that maybe you didn't see during the drilling process. It can give you information about the water chemistry, the water temperature. It can even look for things like faults in the area. So the downhole and analytical part can add a lot of cost to it as well.
All right. As a person who taught earth science back in the day, I better end it right now, so otherwise we may continue. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Mr. Clark, again on the boring and the work to characterize these sites, you mentioned $3 to $5 million in 2 to 4 years, I believe, to characterize a site. At the end of that 2 to 4 years, are you saying that that site is ready for commercial injection, or is there another step after that?
Those figures would probably get you to the point where you're going to, I suppose it's possible that that could get you past the injection testing part to where you're actually putting it online as a commercially viable well. But I think the conservative estimation would be that would get you to the point where you've applied for an underground injection permit, a Class 6 permit with EPA, to do injection testing. And that those costs I'm far less familiar with, but those would be additional costs, additional time.
And just to clarify, do you know of any current characterization going on right now for any of those sites in Iowa?
I am not aware of any active carbon sequestration characterization projects in Iowa.
Thank you.
That, I guess, let me qualify that, that involve drilling.
Thank you. Representative Isenhart for redirect.
Thank you. Just 3 questions to clarify your responses to others. If I were to tell you the 13, then that one question is based on the number of ethanol plants that Summit proposes to serve, would that explain that number in that question?
It explains it to me, yes.
Okay, and you testified that the cost would be 3 to 5 million or more. I took the average 4. 13 times 4 equals 52, so that's why you responded 52 million or more in that question?
Yes.
Okay. You were asked about the parties, private parties who've approached you. You said you wouldn't identify them by name, but is it true your testimony generally refers to them as biofuels, power generation, fertilizer, and cement production industries?
Well, the question I was responding to, I thought, was asking me about the consulting companies that were hired to do work, unless I misunderstood that.
Let's say he was asking you about the identities of the industries, wanting to know. That's in your testimony.
Yes.
What those industries are.
Yes. It says that in my testimony.
Thank you.
Yep.
And the last question is, you're asking about storage fields, where they might be, how big they might be. Is it true that another factor is not just the location and size of the storage fields, but the number of wells that might be needed to get carbon dioxide into that storage facility?
Correct.
And what would that, in general, involve for an average ethanol plant, number of specific wells?
Obviously, I don't think that you would be. I don't think that you would want to rely on characterizing a site fully with just one well. In some of the cases that I've heard that have worked in other states, you drill your first well to gather all your data, and then when it comes time to do injection testing, you drill a second well and construct it in such a way that it can eventually be converted into a permanent injection well.
So there may be multiple wells associated with an individual ethanol plant's storage field?
Yes.
Last question is, what do those wells look like on the surface to the average person? Would you say that they are significant features of the landscape, or would they be kind of hidden as far as the public's concerned?
To qualify my answer, before I give it, I have not seen a carbon sequestration injection well in person. I've seen photos of them in various presentations. They don't look like they're large monstrosities. They look like they have a few feet of steel coming out of the ground that might elbow off to the side, and there might be a small structure next to it from my recollection of seeing photos of it.
But is it fair to say there would be some flexibility in where to locate them in a specific area, if it was in a rural area, to get to a particular storage field?
Yes, I would say that it's reasonable to say that there's some flexibility with the location of the wells.
Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Ryan?
Thank you, Your Honor. Republican Legislative Intervenors for Justice would call Representative Stephen Holt.